Welcome to the Special Needs Kids Are People Too podcast with Amy Bodkin, EDS. Amy is an autistic adult who also happens to be a school psychologist turned special needs consultant and public speaker. She's also a homeschooling mom to 2 autistic kiddos, a yoga instructor, a card-carrying Trekkie, and an all-around fun person. And last but not least, Amy is an advocate for seeing every child as a person, not a diagnosis. Because a special needs kid is just like any other child, just more so. Here's Amy Bodkin.
Hi, I'm Amy Bodkin, and welcome to a special episode of Special Needs Kids Are People Too. This past Memorial Day weekend, I spent the weekend participating in the 47th Annual Convention of the Association for Behavior Analysis International. I spoke with a group at a symposium called Toward Applied Behavior Analysis Reform, What It Means to Do No Harm. It's a topic that I'm extremely passionate about because I feel that with insurance companies paying for a good chunk of ABA services and parents being the legal guardians of minor children or children or adult children who are still under guardianship, it really keeps children from being able, or even adults, from being able to advocate for themselves effectively, and that sometimes the practices used in ABA can actually lead students to compliance, which is problematic because you can be complianced into not being able to advocate for yourself anymore because you have learned to just comply with whatever demands whatever adults put on you, whether those demands are appropriate or abusive or not. So this is a very important topic to me, and I would love your help. I really want to spread the word of what me and others like me that we have joined together to talk about this, and outside of this particular symposium, there are other people in the field and autistic adults who are all advocating for the same thing, and I would really love your help. Please share this podcast, share the podcast website, all over social media, please. I would love to get this information out there to other parents, BCBAs, other healthcare professionals, mental health care professionals. Let's see what we can do to further the conversation of how we can provide the best, safest, most nurturing environment possible so that we can see better outcomes for our kids as they are becoming adults. So, if you guys will share that, I am going to include all of the resources from our symposium on the website, on the blog post. So, once you've heard the highlights from the symposium, if you want to go to the website and download everything that we have on it, then you are more than welcome to it, and we are very excited to share this. My portion of this particular symposium was called Towards a More Ethical and Developmental Approach to Applied Behavior Analysis. And we have a course right now that is being offered at amybodkin.com on this same topic, but expanded much more than was in the symposium. And anyone who takes it, who's a BCBA, can get BCBA CEUs. Maddie Holcomb is on the board of Camp Encourage. She is an autistic advocate for professionals looking for an autistic perspective. And I particularly appreciate Maddie because many people may not realize this, but not all autistics are exactly alike. And Maddie definitely has a perspective that is very different from my experiences and the way I process information. So I greatly value being able to hear her perspective and broaden my own autistic perspective. Her talk is called A Too Short, Very Incomplete Introduction to Masking: The Practice, Effectiveness, Costs, and Ethics of Performing Neurotypically.
So here is the DSM-5's diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder. It can be a bit hard for someone immersed in psychology, language, and education to understand how truly alienating and uncomfortable clinical language can be. But throwing up a wall of text on the screen is pretty universal in its ability to overwhelm the viewer. So that's why this is displayed this much. Persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts as manifested by the following currently or by history. Examples are illustrative, not exhaustive. See text. May not strike us as strange, but this does. Let's look a little closer. I'm just going to breeze through definition of part B of the diagnosis by talking about how behavioralist it is. We categorize this as restrictive, repetitive patterns of behaviors or activities. That is part of the clinical definition of autism. And yet, few autistic, if any autistic individuals I've ever met would describe themselves as such. They talk about this hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. And yet, that isn't the header of the section, even though we've been told repeatedly, and I keep telling people that's the root cause. Instead, it's what's easily observable. This is a downfall of clinical definitions. And it is not unique to autism, but it does need to be highlighted since we're talking about it. That said, mainly we're focusing right now on criterion A, which deals with social communication. It deals a lot with social communication. These are highlighted, the words and phrases used to define what we're measuring when we talk about social communication with regards to autistic people, what we're looking for, what we're judging them against. And that's pretty clearly communicated. Understanding and use of gestures, facial expressions, developing, maintaining relationships, emotional, social reciprocity, normal back and forth conversation. What's more concerning is the way we frame autistic people in this definition as being persistently deficient in these areas. This is the language of hierarchy. And it judges very clearly of normal versus abnormal and puts normal above. This language is deeply concerning and discouraging to autistic people. The experience of masking and camouflaging, when we're talking about that, is the behaviors, effort, and experiences related to trying to socially appear as neurotypical while being autistic. So basically, everything you put in to that performance and everything you get out of it, that all falls vaguely under the umbrella of masking. And if it is under your control, then it is part of what you mean when you are doing masking. Let's talk briefly about learning someone else's social language, because this can be an act of great compassion, empathy, and love. Imagine a romantic partner who isn't particularly interested in musicals, deciding to study up on musicals and listen to them and immerse themselves in theater culture because their partner loves it. And they want to be able to talk about that to their partner and share that excitement. Or of a friend group discovering a new interest together, or of a parent engaging in the kind of play that their child prefers rather than the kind of play that they prefer, so as to better connect to and understand that child. These are loving, caring, beautiful, emotional acts that we'd wish to encourage. That changes when it's the child learning something they don't like and do not appreciate for the parent, or when it is a person trying desperately to conform themselves to the interests and social language of the society they live in for sheer survival. As soon as the power dynamics change, it stops being beautiful and starts being harmful. In the cases of autistic masking, we're talking about the latter, not the former. It's not the beauty of two equals learning to speak to one another and someone bending to embrace another. It's feeling forced into a language that is unnatural and exhausting and harmful to you. It's a lot of self-awareness, and it feels like being constantly on alert of all times, which at the start of it doesn't seem like the worst thing. We all want to encourage self-awareness in our students. And the questions of, are you aware of your body language right now? And what image does it project of you? Is it an image you want? Seems pretty benign. But the questions quickly change to those that seem to have right and wrong answers that we are aware of. We know it's not safe to have body movements that are outside of our control when we're autistic, because those body movements could show something that we don't want to show. We know that we have to manage the perceptions of others. And while we are thinking about all of this in the moment, the conversation is still going on around us. We are often still in public as we are analyzing our choices of just a few seconds ago, and trying to manage our choices at this second, and trying to predict for future parts of the conversation. When your brain is overloaded with these alerts of trying to figure out what your body is going to do at any given moment, it quickly moves out of the realm of logic. There just isn't time. You feel under siege by these thoughts of people watching you, could be watching you at any moment, people judging you, needing to be ready. And you feel really unable to stop. Autistic people report higher levels of anxiety specifically related to masking. And hopefully, looking through these slides, you have some empathy as to why. Meanwhile, even as we're doing this, we're still displaying some signs of autism. We haven't erased it and become completely indistinguishable. And our neurotypical conversation partners aren't even aware of how they are moving. And they are certainly not considering trying to mimic our social behaviors. Why would they? This isn't something that I would encourage neurotypicals to do. It can be painful to try to put on the language of somebody else. And often they don't see enough autistic people in their lives for it to be worth it. But it does create this sense and further this sense of the imbalance of power of I'm mimicking you and you don't seem to care how I'm moving. Masking is baked into the original conception of ABA. It is something that Lovis talked about teaching his kids and showed through very specific examples in the Me book. And we like to think that ABA has grown past it, but in many ways it has not. The JRC still uses very severe adversives that are traumatizing. And masking outside of ABA is still required in many contexts for safety and survival. Together, we can genuinely build a kinder world and restore authenticity in our autistic clients. And that is worth striving for.
Rosie Rossi is an independent contractor and a BCBA. Her talk is Checking Blind Spots, Navigating Neurotypical Standards and Social Skills as it relates to neurodivergent clients. I have particularly appreciated being able to work with Rosie because she chooses to try and listen to the autistic perspective. She's not autistic herself. She doesn't have, I guess you might call, skin in the game, but she wants to try and make better outcomes for her clients. And I respect her taking a stand on this that's sometimes contrary to other people in her field.
Hearing Maddie discuss the harm that can be done by teaching individuals to mask autistic traits is enough to have us rethinking how we teach social skills. To further question how social skills are taught, it's important to also look at the double empathy problem. This term, coined by Dr. Damian Milton, refers to the notion that autistics experience and express emotions differently than non-autistic individuals. It's not that autistics lack communication or social skills, rather they express them in other ways. Therefore, it's challenging for autistics to empathize with non-autistics and vice versa. There is a breakdown of communication because of neurological differences and different interactions with the environment. However, because of how society is currently structured, the burden falls on autistics to conform to neurotypical environments. The first step in reforming our practice is recognizing the blind spots we have in understanding the autistic experience and acknowledge that the goal shouldn't be for our clients to be indistinguishable from their peers. If the goal is for your autistic client to be indistinguishable from neurotypical peers, there is a good chance that we are teaching them to mask their autistic traits that are inherently a part of who they are. Furthermore, the assessments we use are often based on neurotypical norms, and the goals are selected based on these standards without consideration from autistic individuals. Our assessments can be used to select socially valid goals, but we must work closely with our client and listen to autistic voices when selecting social skills goals. When selecting social skills goals, we need to be incredibly mindful of why they're being targeted. Are they truly of value to the client, or are we teaching them for the sake of conforming to neurotypical norms? Additionally, when teaching these skills, we must teach that they are an option for the client, not behaviors they must engage in. And I'll go into this greater detail in a little bit. The goal should not be for our autistic learners to be indistinguishable from peers. Rather, it should be to teach them skills that are in line with their values and unique circumstances. So, what should we as non-autistic behavior analysts do? How do we promote acceptance of autistic differences and teach social skills that are of value to our client? Let's start by doing what we can at a macro level. As mentioned when discussing the double empathy problem, autistic individuals are tasked with learning how to conform and communicate with non-autistic individuals. Really, it should be a two-way street. If you're in a setting that allows for it, such as a classroom, educate neurotypical individuals about autism and communication differences. Next, we need to be humble and listen to autistic criticisms of common ABA practices without immediately going into defensive mode. Then we need to consider that feedback and reform our practices. The point of this presentation is not to say we should never teach social skills, Rather, it's that we need to be extremely mindful as non-autistic practitioners that we have the potential to unintentionally teach our clients to engage in masking behaviors that do more harm than good. Before teaching our clients about neurotypical social norms, we need to first teach them to identify their rights and advocate for themselves. Becoming involved in the autistic community could be one of the best ways to reinforce social behaviors. Many of us work with very young children or autistic individuals that also have intellectual disabilities or do not yet have a verbal communication system. With these clients, it may be more challenging to identify their values and goals, but it doesn't mean they can't give input. As we all know, behavior is communication. Observing their behavior in the natural environment can help us identify reinforcers and aversive stimuli, that give insight into what goals will be of value to their lives. For instance, if a client is demonstrating an intense interest in cars, start by pairing yourself with how they engage with the toy cars and then begin to model other ways to play with them. Find peers that also enjoy playing with cars and use that common interest to start social interactions. Additionally, observe their behavior during the intervention, and when it's no longer reinforcing, model or prompt a functional communicative response for termination. With the previous example, if the client begins to move away from the peer while playing with cars, model saying bye and allow him to leave the environment. Additionally, seeking consultation from autistic adults could provide insight into environmental stimuli that may be evoking automatically reinforcing behaviors. As neurotypical individuals, we might not recognize the bright lights or humming sounds that are evoking negatively reinforced elopement from certain environments. Autistic consultants could identify environmental stimuli that would otherwise be overlooked. In closing, it's time to change the way we view and teach social skills. Hopefully, this talk provided some direction on how to do this. Please be humble and check your blind spots. Listen to autistic voices and be willing to reform common practices. Thank you.
Katie Murray is a recent graduate of Chicago School of Professional Psychology and a BCBA consultant. Her talk is Current BCBA Training. What did I just learn? She talks about how the training she went through had weaknesses and gaps that need to be addressed if we want to produce ethical BCBAs that can provide a supportive, nurturing environment for autistics that protects them from abuse. I really appreciate Katie's perspective because she's coming at this as a brand new BCBA, and she's already recognizing the problems that exist in the field and the need for reform.
So here we can see how our verified course sequence is broken down. So there's 45 hours dedicated to the ethics code, 90 in concepts and principles, 90 in measurement and assessment, 60 in behavior change programs, and 30 in supervision. And all of these are totally important to our education, but what isn't here? So there are 0 hours dedicated to the autism culture or autistic perspective, 0 hours on trauma, or 0 hours on human development as a whole. So for me, personally, the gaps in my education really hit home for me when I got my very first BCBA job as a consultant for a foster care agency. And I thought that was so cool, being able to work in the foster care system and help kids with autism. My whole reason for pursuing this credential was to find meaning in my work and help others, and this job felt exactly like that. It felt like I had stumbled upon a really unique opportunity, not only as a BCBA, but as a brand new BCBA. However, it was this job that I work now that really shed light on to how much I was not prepared. I didn't know much about trauma or respondent-operant interactions. During my coursework, we looked at these things briefly, but mostly from a research perspective, but not how it applied to our clients that we served, let alone how these things could negatively impact our clients. In the concepts and principles course, there was a lack of emphasis on private events and learning histories unique to each individual. The impression that I got is that we should always avoid being mentalistic. I think that was drained into my mind so much that it really distracted from the importance of private events and experiences and how those experiences shape our behavior, how trauma histories shape our behavior, how some of our basic interventions are lacking this consideration. So maybe you're thinking, well, you just said that working in the foster care system as a BCBA was a really unique opportunity. Most of us BCBAs don't work with a traumatized population. But that's what I never considered. The autism community is highly impacted by trauma. In an article written by Lauren Grabitz titled "At the Intersection of Autism and Trauma," she states, in speaking with participants about the causes of trauma, she has heard everything from sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and horrendous bullying to much broader concepts like what it's like to go around your whole life in a world where you have 50% less input than everyone else because you have social deficits, or feeling constantly overwhelmed by sensory experience, feeling marginalized in our society because you're somebody with differences. In other words, she says, the experience of having autism and the trauma associated with that. How was I never exposed to this? As someone who is going to be working primarily with the autistic community, we expect individuals to learn how to communicate through MAN training, tacting. We use the VB map assessment as our guiding tool. But what if our clients don't have the skill level to be able to do that yet? What if their trauma history is a major barrier in being able to even feel safe enough to even be able to learn these skills? Of course, working with foster families prompted me to seek additional consultation from trauma-informed professionals, but I would not have done that if I had not been in this exact position. It's not common for BCBAs to seek additional consultation, especially outside of their own agencies, but we should be. I would argue that by the end of our course sequence, most of us are not competent enough to take into consideration the autistic perspective, especially through a trauma-informed lens. And the course sequence matters because it shapes who we are going to become as professionals. It's the foundation of our training. And if the foundation of our training is lacking a very specific perspective from the clients that we serve, an education that we need not only to make meaningful and effective change, but to avoid harming our clients, then it needs to change. We need to adjust, we need to listen, and we need to do better. So what exactly were those things that I had never considered? I think I can conceptualize the breakdown that I experienced into two different categories. So the first one being autistic culture, and then the second one being emotional needs. So after talking to autistics themselves, I realized that although for neurotypical people, eye contact isn't inherently aversive, it is highly painful for some autistic individuals. Anecdotally, autistics have said that eye contact burns, it's terribly stressful, and is overall uncomfortable. Hajikani 2017 conducted a research study that concluded when constrained to look in the eyes, individuals with ASD show abnormally high activation in the subcortical system, which may be the basis of their eye avoidance in daily life. For a number of my clients, I was taught to record eye contact as either a correct or incorrect data point during my sessions, especially during some of those social programs that we were running, without any regard to how it was affecting them physiologically. So parent consideration. This is probably the hugest breakdown that I noticed right away, especially after learning more about the autistic culture, was not knowing how to help parents get in contact with autistic folks and how to educate them on masking, on eye contact, on stimming, everything that I had just learned myself. However, now this has been such a huge part of my practice. And I've had so many aha moments with parents once they got into contact with an autistic consultant and understood their child on a deeper, more honest level. So restrictive interest and repetitive movements. So we all know that the DSM-5 describes one of the main symptoms of autism as having these restrictive interests and repetitive movements. As BCBAs, we've been taught to view these things, these traits, as something to treat instead of looking at the function of these behaviors as emotionally regulating. I now know that stims can serve many helpful functions and should not be something to treat. The first thing I think of here is quiet hands. Many therapists, parents, teachers believe that a child must be sitting quietly and not moving in order to learn, or in order to demonstrate attentiveness and listening. But here's the thing, stimming has not only been shown to be emotionally regulating, but it could help our clients be able to learn and to be able to concentrate. Again, we are lacking this perspective. So I want to touch on the breakdown of emotional needs. So I know we've all been taught, do not reinforce the problem behavior. Wait, what exactly does that mean? So during my time as an RBT, I was so focused on making sure that I wasn't reinforcing problem behavior by giving it attention. But by merely focusing on this concept in and of itself, I was not meeting my clients' emotional needs and yet expecting them to learn during some of these highly stressful meltdown situations. Also, I want to talk about the fact that we call it problem behavior. Viewing behavior as a problem instead of as a means of communicating distress is the problem. We are taught techniques to drive down behavior, but again, we are not taught how to support the emotional needs, and language matters. And when we call something a problem, it's not only extremely stigmatizing to the individual, but I would argue is also very unhelpful. When I write treatment plans now, I call them behaviors of concern, because of course there's going to be behaviors that we want to completely extinguish due to safety concerns, etc. These behaviors may be very concerning. Our entire lives, we are taught to meet other people's needs. And then all of a sudden in ABA, we're taught that a child should not be crying. And that is dehumanizing. What I don't consider a problem or concern is crying or showing emotions. Targeting crying as a topography for the behavior for decrease is something I will never do again. Crying is human. Crying is a coping mechanism. It is not a problem. I would argue that discrete child training definitely lacks the emotional needs aspect. I remember even as a brand new RBT that DTT sometimes felt icky and robotic, and escape extinction is a huge part of discrete child training. The classic example is a child trying to leave the table during your DTT program, so you block them from leaving and either one, force them to complete the task, or two, require them to functionally communicate that they want to leave. There's no regard for trauma histories or whether or not this may be extremely aversive for the child or even traumatizing. Eloping is a form of assent withdrawal, and if your client is clearly communicating that they do not want to be at the table, whether that means they're screaming, they're crying, they're eloping, then we should be honoring that type of communication and looking at the reason why this type of learning approach is making them want to bolt out the door. So as far as I'm concerned, based on everything that we just discussed, I don't think that we are abiding by our own ethics code. 1.02 boundaries of competence. So based on our current training requirements, I do not think we are competent enough to be accepting autistic individuals as clients without additional supervision. How can we say that we're competent in autism if our education doesn't even teach us what it means to be autistic? We are getting a lot of neurotypical feedback from parents, schools, etc., but we are not getting in line with the autistic experience. Again, we should be consulting with autistic individuals to get some insight of how to proceed.
And now for a word from our sponsors. Today's show is sponsored by me, Amy Bodkin Consulting Services. You can find what we have to offer professionals at amybodkin.com. We offer consulting services for professionals, whether you are an author or a therapist who works with children, especially if you have questions regarding autistic clients and the autistic experience. I bring my professional experience, having been trained as a school psychologist, as well as my personal experience as being an autistic adult with a variety of learning disabilities, and as a mom to kids who also are autistic and have a variety of learning disabilities. You can also go to our website and check out the new course that we have available that is specifically geared towards ABA therapists. The purpose of this course is to examine what we are doing as professionals and how we may work to strengthen our ethics and to reframe the way that we think about children to provide a more positive, nurturing environment that will lead to more long-term positive goals as well as reducing trauma in children. Check it out at amybodkin.com. Amy Bodkin, that's me, is an autistic school psychologist turned autistic consultant. And my talk was towards a more ethical and developmental approach to applied behavior analysis. One of the things that I think is particularly helpful when it comes to looking at children and adults as people and treating them as people is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Most of the time, we spend all of our time focused on learning, especially with ABA. That's kind of the point. But in reality, Learning is at the very top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And we've got to have all those other layers below it to be ready to be there. And so I'd like to explore what these little different levels are. If you're not familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's been around for a long time, obviously created by Maslow. The lowest part of the pyramid is physiological needs, and that's going to be things like air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, all of the things that you need to survive. And then the next one is safety needs. And that's going to be things more like personal security, making sure that you have money to support yourself, having good health, having your things and your things not being threatened, basically feeling safe, secure, and not threatened. The next level is love and belonging. And that includes things like friendship and family and having positive relationships in your life. The next level is esteem, and that is having self-esteem, respect for oneself, feeling strong, having a sense of freedom. And there can be a lot of different things that go in with this, but mostly it comes down to self-esteem. And then finally, the top layer is self-actualization. And this is the desire to become the most that one can be. That is where learning happens, whether that's academic learning or it's behavioral learning, it doesn't matter. But that's where learning happens. If you're starving to death, I don't think you're going to really care about your ABA behavior goals. Probably not going to happen. So let's take a little closer look at the physiological needs and the safety needs, because those are really kind of the base ones. And a lot of times we just assume that those have been met. But there's a lot of different reasons why this should be considered a little more carefully. First of all, I don't know if you know this, but the average age or lifespan for an autistic adult is 36 years old. I am an old autistic because I am 38. I have surpassed the average lifespan. And the reason that the average lifespan is 36 years old is because when we're small, we have a high risk of accidental death. As we get older, we develop, a lot of bullying and mental health issues happen. And so a lot of times we have a higher rate of suicide in our teen years. And then if we finally manage to make it to adulthood, then we usually spend so much time masking and trying to pretend to be someone that we're not, that we end up with mental health problems. And not just the mental health problem, that it causes so much stress and anxiety that it can cause physiological health problems like autoimmune conditions. If you're familiar at all with the research on ACEs, adverse childhood experiences or events, it's a huge problem. There is such a significant correlation between these events of chronic stress and anxiety and fight or flight that it leads to serious health conditions, heart disease, cancer, autoimmune conditions, and it's an extremely strong correlation. And this is a problem. And especially since autistic health isn't really understood very well, so much of the research for autism has been funneled into early intervention and ABA, for example, that very little research has been done on autistic health, which is very unfortunate for those of us who've made it this far, because there's so many things we don't know about how our bodies work. And we end up talking to each other going, well, have you had this happen? And what did you find out that meant? It's an issue. So, and then also we don't exhibit the same symptoms as everybody else always, and we don't always feel things the same way because our sensory pathways aren't the same as everybody else's. And How are you going to know if your client has a physiological problem if they can't feel it or communicate it to you in the way that you would expect to? How do you know? You don't. You have to learn to be the detective and look very carefully, which is really honestly one of the strengths that you do have as an ABA therapist. You're very good at observation. What we need to do is hone those skills so that you look even closer and find some of the missing details. And as far as safety goes, that ties right into that. Because if people are taking your things and there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to it, or if you're not getting access to the things that you feel like you need, or if you're just not experiencing the world the way everybody else does, sometimes you can feel like you're in the middle of an Indiana Jones movie at that leap of faith where he has to step out onto the canyon and he can't see that there's a bridge below him, but he just has to step out anyways on faith. Can you imagine what it would be like to live almost every moment of your day in that one moment in time? That is how I describe being autistic. It's living every moment of every day in that one moment and trying to learn coping strategies to let go of the anxiety and trying to tell yourself, hey, you know what? You don't have to take that step of faith or leap of faith out there every day if you don't want to. The next two levels go together well. There's love and belonging and esteem needs. I have heard it said that we are not vending machines. You can't keep going up and saying, say hello, my name is so-and-so. Because if you keep doing that over and over again, eventually we will run out of treats in our vending machine. We're people. Living, breathing, feeling people. And in order to feel love and belonging, it has to be a healthy love and belonging. We know when someone's faking it. We know when someone doesn't really like us. When someone just wants us to do something that they want us to do. We can also easily be manipulated and gaslighted. And a lot of times that is done under the guise of that being okay. And it's not. There was a educator in the late 1800s. Her name was Charlotte Mason. She was a contemporary of Maria Montessori. And I love a quote that she has regarding this topic. And I think it is worth considering. The principles of authority on the one hand and of obedience on the other are natural, necessary, and fundamental. Meaning, there are always going to be things in this life where there's someone in authority and then we have to obey, whether that's the laws of our country or in a job that you don't want to get fired from. There's always going to be those kinds of things, and that's natural. But these principles are limited by the respect due to the personality of children, which must not be encroached upon, whether by the direct use of fear or love, suggestion or influence, or by undue play upon any one natural desire. How many times have you heard someone try to scare a child into doing something that they didn't want to do? How many times have you heard someone say, oh, but if you love me, you'll do this for me, or please do this if you love me, or you love your mommy, please do this for me. Those are fairly common things that adults use to get children to do things. Special needs are not. Not to mention suggestion or influence or undue play upon any one natural desire. Would you like some candy? Would you like a treat? Would you like to play with your toy? That's all using a natural desire. Or giving them suggestion or influence. Oh, well, yeah, that doesn't look like that to me. I didn't experience it that way. You're wrong. That's not how it really is. Well, maybe that's not how you're experiencing it, but that doesn't mean the child isn't experiencing it that way. As a society, we have got to learn to respect children, to see them as people, and to offer them love and belonging in a healthy way. That is what leads to esteem, to self-esteem. When we have healthy, loving relationships where people trust us enough to spread our wings and try things for ourselves and to make mistakes and to make failings. When people do that, that's where we develop a sense of confidence, that we can try things, that we can fail, that it's okay. And that's really important. And also on this respecting thing, can we talk for just a moment about setting behavioral goals? I get a lot of ABA reports across my desk, and I very often see behavioral goals that are things like, so-and-so will sit at the lunch table for 20 minutes, 4 days out of the week. Oh, really? How are you going to get so-and-so to do that? It seems to me that the children aren't often the ones who need the goals. It's the adults. We are the ones who should task ourselves with providing our children with a supportive, loving environment with all the supports necessary, and then let them see what they'll do with it. They can do amazing things when we give them all the right supports. Patience, love, acceptance, seeing the wonder of who they already are instead of looking for what's wrong. And if we can do that, we can reach self-actualization. We can reach a point where learning can happen, where growth can happen, where we get to see the person that child already is flowering and flourishing. Thank you for joining me. If you want to hear more about what we were talking about here, this is a very small part of a CEU course that I'm offering on my website, amybodkin.com. Jamin Detmering, she is the discussant for this talk. She is a BCBA consultant as well as a professional adjunct lecturer at National Louis University and an ABD in the PhD Applied Behavior Analysis program at Chicago School of Professional Psychology. Jamin's job as the discussant is to sum up all of the other talks into a nice, neat package for us. What I particularly appreciate about Jamin is how much she has put on the line to make sure that there is change. She brings in autistic speakers at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. She has put together this symposium as well as a couple others. And she's also consulted with I don't know how many autistic advocates about how to best serve her clients. She has really worked at changing the face of ABA from the beginning with the students that she works with at the universities.
Before I get started, I want to note that I'm stepping in for a brilliant autistic BCBA who I would have loved for you to hear from directly. She elected not to participate in ABAI this year as an act of self-care. If you've been listening and learning from the autistic perspectives in this talk, it should be no surprise that participating in the ABA field is stressful for autistic folks. Not only do autistic folks have to expend energy to navigate a world arranged for neurotypicals, but as advocates in the field, they are inundated with examples of autistic clients being exposed to ableist and harmful practices. Perhaps the most extreme is the use of contingent electric shock at the Judge Rotenberg Center, who has members presenting in this conference, and less extreme interventions that are implemented with the best of intention are ubiquitous in today's ABA. Further, when these transgressions are pointed out to the well-meaning practitioners, there's a flood of naysayers who believe their education is superior to the lived experience of autistic people who are graciously attempting to educate our field. Given the topic of this symposium and that ABAI has provided a platform to the Judge Rotenberg Center, the choice to withdraw participation from ABAI is understandable. In fact, I think that it's commendable that she is prioritizing her own needs. It is not enough to be aware of autism. We should accept, support, respect, and include autistic people. I think that this is a really important consideration for BCBAs working with autistic clients. Amy stated in her talk, when you chip away at a person, it's painful. Oof, it was hard to think about times when I may have chipped away at my clients. We need to get interested in a shift of perspective. Instead of a focus on remediating deficits, we need to seek to create an environment that nurtures growth. For far too long, we have put the burden on autistic people to adapt to the allistic world. Our job isn't to make clients less autistic. It's to make sure that our autistic clients suffer less. What concessions are neurotypicals making to adapt to autistic folks? Maddie shared with us the weight of a constant expectation to conform to a world that doesn't make sense to you. Do we extend the same to autistic folks? In pursuit of a world where autistic people are accepted, we need to ensure that they have a seat at the table. Autistic people's worth shouldn't be measured by their understanding of our science or their credentials. Instead, we need to move towards community-based participatory research practices, where community members are treated as partners in the process. They're sharing the decision-making. They have ownership over the research. This is a stark difference from the current neurotypical autistic hierarchy. We need to do a way better job of getting social validity data, more than an obligatory Likert scale at the end of research. What are actual measures of well-being? How can we be sure that our procedures aren't causing any harms to clients? What if in operating from our client's perspective, there's a different reality? Katie and Rosie both mentioned several times in their talks the importance of seeking consultation from autistic advocates. That is how we gain awareness of what we don't know. Speaking from personal experience, consulting with the autistic community, I've been able to get insight on sensory experiences and accommodations that I probably wouldn't have considered on my own. I've learned so much about the autistic experience, and that informs my practice. I can still use our science and I can still approach problems or concerns in a conceptually systematic way, but I have better insight. I think that it's important to consider that our clients' needs may not be getting met. Amy educated us on the disparities in research of the physical health of autistic folks. It is wild to believe that the average lifespan is 36 years old. 36. That is what the current contingencies are arranged to produce. We have a lot to learn about autistic health and how symptoms are experienced by autistic people. It may not occur to us that from the perspective of our client, that their safety needs aren't being met. I think that Amy's examples of items being taken away or restricted are especially relevant given these are common practices in ABA. With the best of intentions, we remove items from our clients to, say, increase their manding repertoire, or we might do it to decrease interfering behaviors. Are we taking the time to consider that our clients may not have an understanding of why it's happening, that it's unsettling or scary, makes them feel unsafe? Do we think about the fact that navigating a neurotypical world feels like a constant leap of faith, one which parents, therapists, and educators are eagerly pushing clients off the cliff? Another point that both Amy and Maddie address is that autistic people experience a world where they're not accepted. They have relationships that aren't genuine. Rather, ABA therapists and other professionals hang out with a client in order to build a relationship so that they can change their behavior. It's not authentic. They don't really want to get to know the client. They hear people talk about them. They're gaslighted. To make matters worse, we ask parents to continue these practices outside of session. How can we possibly be making autistic clients feel safe and loved and accepted? How can they possibly develop any sort of positive self-esteem? I think that one way to counter this experience is to prioritize self-advocacy and assent, as Rosie discussed in her talk. If our clients are treated as the experts of their body, they can learn to listen to it. If we are making accommodations and following their lead, we're creating an environment where they're safe to navigate. They have people who are creating space for them to feel loved and like they belong. They can be confident that the way they feel is the way they feel and what they want is what they want. They're not gaslighted. And then they can get to the top of Maslow's hierarchy of need, to the self-actualization, where the most learning can occur. As Katie discussed, our current training is not producing competent practitioners. Currently, our training is grounded in ABC contingencies. We teach students that there are 4 functions of behavior, and you simply make problem behavior ineffective and desirable behavior effective. We need a more sophisticated conceptualization. Our training needs to teach students that there's a plethora of variables influencing behavior, not just the immediate environment. We need to better understand sensory thresholds and that sensory experiences change. They ebb and flow with changes in the environment. Students need to be ready to consider that when their clients are menstruating or didn't get enough sleep, they may be smelling, hearing, or tasting things differently, and that may be impeding their ability to focus on the materials we're trying to get them to learn. We need to understand the toll of masking that Maddie described, and that it may be a setting event for subsequent behavior. Our clients may be worn out after a long period of time of masking that takes energy. And we need perspective on the distinction between authentic relationships and pairing for the sake of manipulating behavior. I'm guilty of that. We need to understand respondent behaviors are elicited by the immediate environment in the context of a larger trauma history, and that our clients are operating in multiple cultures that influence their behavior, just like us. It is our job to support and listen to clients, to teach them to listen to their bodies, and that autism is beautiful. We can teach them about neurotypical social skills, but it should be for the sake of making an informed choice, not to manipulate, not to make them behave the way that we behave or what we deem to be socially acceptable. Rather than teaching our students to implement a list of interventions proven to be effective, at least by the neurotypical researchers' standards set, we need them to understand that interventions must be carefully designed and implemented, centering on the client perspective. We can still use the strategies that we know and have learned, but it needs to be done in a supportive and person-centered way. We need to do it with nuance. We need to carefully consider the client's behavior in the context and ask ourselves, what do they want? What does this client value? If your client is non-speaking, look for other behaviors to inform your interventions. What seems to make them happy? What seems to make them sad? If they did talk, can we take a guess at what they might say? We can guess a lot about an individual's wishes based off of their behavior. This is a tricky process. Many of our clients have long histories of compliance training, so cooperation may present as assent, but those behaviors are often under aversive rather than appetitive control. We may think that our clients are using positive interventions without considering, or we may think that we are using positive interventions with our clients without considering that if we're only giving our client one way to get the things that they like, that's actually a coercive contingency.
I hope that you have found the highlights from our symposium to be enlightening, and perhaps to have piqued your interest to learn a little bit more about what we are trying to accomplish with the ABA reform movement. I appreciate you listening. Please share this on social media so that we can gain a little bit more ground in trying to make sure that we provide services for children that keep them as the client, that allow them to be their own advocates so that they don't just learn to comply and to comply with any demand made of them, regardless of whether or not the person making the demand has their best interests at heart. The only person who can know what's going on inside their body is them. And we have to give them the opportunity to be able to communicate those needs to us in whatever way works for them. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to our next chat next week on the podcast.
We hope you had fun listening to today's episode and gained some new insights into the wonderful variety of people in our world. You can find out more about Amy's advocacy work at amybodkin.com. And remember, special needs kids are people too.